Councilmember Sneddon.
Here.
Chair Oscar Gutierrez.
Present.
Thank you.
Okay, let's have the minutes reflect that we're all present. And Ms. Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda?
There are no changes to the agenda.
Do we have any public comments not related to the item?
Chair Gutierrez, we have no public comment for items not on the agenda.
Thank you. Let's read the first agenda item, please.
Item number 1, amendment to single-family design board appeal process.
Okay, may we have the staff report, please?
Thank you. My name is Ellen Kokinda. I'm the Design Review Supervisor in the Planning Division, and I'm here to talk to the Ordinance Committee today about the amendment to the Single Family Design Board appeal process. So I do want to put this in context. We are currently working on a larger Single Family Design Board process improvement initiative, and this stemmed from the NOVAC report that came out in 2020. We have, I want to just point out a couple of goals, and then I'm going to talk specifically about this one particular piece for today's conversation. So as part of our process improvements for Single Family Design Board, we're looking to eliminate some of the design review triggers for projects that aren't necessarily integral to the SFDB's purpose and intent. And we also are looking to expand administrative approvals. And what that means is that sets up the ability for staff to approve projects that don't necessarily require a public hearing. Secondly, we want to maintain a public forum. So what this means is when the Single Family Design Board was created, it was really the first time that there was a discretionary process for single-family residences, and that was really important, and I don't think we want to lose that quality, particularly for projects that do tend to be a little bit more controversial or that might have the biggest impact to a neighbor or neighborhood. So again, maintaining that public forum is really critical to SFDB's process. And then lastly, as part of our process improvement goals, we want to be able to set expectations for success and really setting clear guidance for how we address neighborhood compatibility, and that is for all of our constituents. That's for our Single Family Design Board members, it's for our applicants, it's for members of the public to be able to understand what neighborhood compatibility is, and then it's really for staff as well in terms of how we review projects and how we can help set up better review processes for board members. So that's kind of the context to the larger initiative, but I'm here today specifically to request your consideration for amending the Municipal Code 2269080 to direct the Single Family Design Board appeals to the Planning Commission instead of the City Council. Please note that this is only for the Single Family Design Board. This doesn't include the Architectural Board of Review or Historic Landmarks Commission, and that's very intentional because the city charter, those two boards and commissions are charter advisory groups, and so it's written within the charter that any decision must be appealed to City Council. So there's not much we can touch from that, but the Single Family Design Board is not a charter board, and it is just written within our municipal code. And why are we suggesting this particular process improvement is that we think the number of SFDB appeals is trending upward. We are seeing over time the number of design review triggers for the Single Family Design Board have increased significantly. And if we look back at our last 3 years of project data, we've seen a lot of second-story additions, demo rebuilds of new homes, adding accessory dwelling units that no longer meet the ministerial design criteria, which then kick them into the public hearing process and discretionary review. All of these things that are adding density, adding a little bit of height, starting to create a little bit more neighborhood friction. That's one of the reasons why we think that we'll continue to see more. This process to take something from the City Council and redirect these appeals to the Planning Commission could be more streamlined for applicants and appellants. On a bi-weekly basis, I watch projects, single-family homeowners apply for their project, and then oftentimes, if it is a larger or more controversial item, it can go 3 or 4 times to the Single Family Design Board over the course of a year and a half. And by the time we get to the point where someone has appealed a decision, that could be a couple of months of a three-step process to first schedule a project at the city council and then actually schedule the appeal hearing and then a follow-up resolution. So that could, again, bump those projects out another 3 or 4 months. So those people haven't even gotten a planning approval, haven't even gotten to the building permit application stage. And same thing, there's kind of savings and anxiety for, and appellants could be anybody. It could be a neighbor, it could be the applicant. It really just depends on the decision of the single-family design board and kind of what's been approved or denied. So it can just be extremely time-intensive, and so we're aware of that from a permit streamlining initiative. Thirdly, we've got appeals are extremely labor-intensive and involve multiple departments. Just within the planning division alone, I review staff reports to the liaison, the single-family design board liaison. The city planner looks at these reports. The community development director, multiple people, administrative staff are looking at the reports and the PowerPoints and the noticing. That's just within community development. We have the city attorney's office. We have the city clerk's office who does all of the communications with the appellants and applicants and city council members. We have the city administrator's office reviewing and doing quality control after it's gone through our review. And so it just is, we've historically subsidize these. We have never accounted for all of our time spent on them. And like I said, with the three-step process, it can just be pretty demanding and a little bit confusing as things break down, sometimes with communication. And then we also just acknowledge that from a process improvement standpoint, that the Planning Commission is accustomed to plan review, and they are very familiar with understanding the land use issues of the day and being up to date on state legislation and our current land use policies and the zoning code, as well as design impacts. They're very much accustomed to having to review, even though they're not an aesthetic board, they're a board that looks at land use approvals. They are aware of the design guidelines and how they operate and how they interact and kind of the layers of review that are added in addition to the code requirements, but the guidelines that are also applied. And then we also think that in terms of just seeing potentially a trend in SFDB appeals. This is not, in the last 5 or 6 months, we've had 4 SFDB appeals in front of council, and that could just be a statistical anomaly. However, that's not necessarily what we think is going to happen, and so it can be really, sometimes we can get on a city council agenda quickly, and sometimes it takes several months, but the benefit of being able to take it through to the Planning Commission is also that the Planning Commission is kind of in-house, I'll say, because we have our own mailing, noticing operations, and we have our own staff. We're only working with the city attorney's office, and then, of course, our internal community development staff. So it's just more efficient and less administrative work overall, and so that could be a lot of time savings. And I'd just like to acknowledge that we took this idea to the Land Development Team Oversight Subcommittee, which is a city council subcommittee, and they were very supportive of fast-tracking this particular initiative, and they've also got a full update on the other SFDB process improvements. So that's one piece. That's going to be the very specific piece of legislation that we're asking, that we have ordinance language for your comments. But there's also a second piece to this, which we're asking for your consideration and comments, which is the number of appealable SFDB actions. And we're asking you to request consideration of reducing the total number of appeal points from 2 to 1. So what does that mean? A project is submitted for SFDB review. It generally goes through concept review. And then finally, when staff have determined that a project is complete, meaning we have all the information to do our environmental review, and we can say that it meets all zoning regulations and code, then we can schedule that for project design approval. And that project design approval is the approval of the massing and kind of the development development envelope, I'll say, and overall kind of the aesthetics and the placement and site considerations. And then secondly, once you get project design approval, applicants come back for final approval. And that's all the very small details, architectural details and different things, and materials, colors, palette, certain things like that. So right now, our municipal code is written that you can appeal both actions. So that means that we've technically set people up for a lot of extra potential process that we don't necessarily think is necessary. So again, why do we want to bring this idea to you? One is that this was an idea that came through the Novak report, and as an idea for streamlining to say, okay, you don't need 2 appeal points, 1 is sufficient. We could decrease the delays in the building permit application. So we don't even allow people to submit for their building permit application until 10 days after a final appeal approval is made. So you have to get your final appeal, wait the 10 calendar days in case someone submits an appeal, and then you're able to submit your building permit application. So it kind of, any reduction in time to kind of get people onto what they really want to do, which is to have a nicer home, is beneficial. We want to reduce the public uncertainty about an appeal. What does that mean? That's really, it's confusing to have 2 appeal points. Nobody understands. If I say project design approval and final approval, no one in the public who just understands that. That's like jargon, that's planning jargon. It's specific to Santa Barbara. It's not helpful to have such a confusing process. And so again, going from 2 to 1 could be beneficial from that standpoint of like, when is it most important to participate and what is the most important appeal point? It's that project design approval. That's what people are really appealing, because if you get to the point where you're appealing final approval, that's all minor stuff. It's so tiny, and your purview is so limited as a decision maker in what you can actually look at. As I said, appeals are really staff intensive and involve multiple departments. I don't need to reiterate that. It's the same process, whether it's project design approval or a final approval appeal. And I would argue that for a final approval appeal, that's a lot of staff time to just focus on something so granular. And then we think that the 1 SFDB appeal is sufficient. Again, it's very different. Architectural Board of Review and HLC are very different design review bodies, but when we get to single family homes, we can require that people have this final approval information up front at the time of project design approval. So that's one way we might be able to accomplish reducing this, is just saying, okay, when we schedule you for project design approval, you're expected to have those architectural details. You're expected to have the specific colors and the material selection and the specific windows that you're proposing, so that we're clear and that we don't need to have yet another public hearing for that. So that's just conceptually how we're thinking of working this. And the reason we didn't necessarily bring specific ordinance changes is that we do need to work with our LDT partners to kind of communicate how to figure this out process-wise and what's the best way to draft this, so that it makes the most sense for Ordinance Committee review. So I took this idea to the Planning Commission about a week and a half ago, and in terms of this specific ordinance change to reroute SFDB appeals to the Planning Commission instead of City Council, there was unanimous support for that. They did feel that SFDB, we received comments that it really, only 1 appeal point is sufficient for single family design board, and that should be at the project design approval stage. And then I just want to point out some of these things are part of the larger process improvement conversation, and they wanted to provide City Council some food for thought. So some things that really make sense from an appeal standpoint of how can the minutes be more thorough, and I think part of that is the motion making. How can we try to capture the conversations a little bit better so that the decision maker understands the nuances of what was discussed and what were the issues. Some design guidelines should become ordinances. How can we create certain standards and getting input on that? We heard that we want some better definition for the enforcement process, and neighborhood compatibility should be better defined. There will never be perfection with defining neighborhood compatibility. Discretionary review in and of itself is subjective, and that's really difficult. And you might have multiple people, an appellant and an applicant, who are right. But it's to what extent is this project acceptable? Can you get to the point where you can make those findings? Did they do sufficient job making sure that the design guideline, the intentions of the design guidelines are met, that they've thought about their neighbors, that they've thought about privacy, that they've thought about kind of the massing and kind of the site location, and is all of that appropriate, and can you make those findings? But we have I've been working with the AIA advocacy group as well as past and present board members, and we're very much committed to trying to better define that, because when this document was created, our single-family design board guidelines, it's a really phenomenal set of guidelines, but there are instances where I call them problem areas where we could target a little bit more. So you'll be seeing us come back with more information, having worked with our community partners on that. And then we also heard that, again, definitions for mass, bulk, and scale. What does this mean? And then trying to create information and have information readily available, particularly for a lot of the folks who come into our public hearings who've never participated in a public hearing ever before in their lives. So we got some really great conversation at the Planning Commission overall. So my recommendation to you today is to amend Municipal Code 2269-080 to direct the SFDB appeals to the Planning Commission instead of the City Council. And then also determine that the project is categorically exempt from further environmental review. And then I'm separately, as I've kind of mentioned with this other point, we'd just love to hear your comments on the concept of reducing the number of appeal points from 2 to 1 at SFDB. So I have some basic questions for the Ordinance Committee, and again, just general agreement with this direction, and again, the idea of reducing the number of appeal points, and if you have any other specific recommendations or requests. And just before just wrap up my presentation, I just want to, again, pause and let you know that this is part of the larger SFDB process improvement where the next steps for us, we are targeting the design guidelines and looking at those problem areas, so where we can do some further definition analysis and trying to create those clearer guidelines, as well as help looking at our processes and how staff can do a better job to help the review process. We are going to be coming back to the Land Development Team Oversight Subcommittee to look at those design review triggers and to have very specific hard data on what kind of projects we're seeing and the type of, if we do this, here's the number of projects that we might expect not to go to a public hearing and what those are, so that kind of ordinance language. And then the last bullet point is where we are now, is just the idea that asking today if we could get your support in order for this to be discussed at the full City Council. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that report. I'd like to open it to my colleagues for questions. Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, Ms. Kokenda. I have a few. Tell me where site visits will fit in this for Planning Commission. I forget when Planning Commission goes on site visits. Council has trouble making site visits. So just tell me how that's going to work, if it is an appeal to Planning Commission, and how are you going to handle, or are you going to handle site visits?
Thank you, Councilmember Jordan. I'm going to pass this off to Ms. Ostringer, who might have more specific guidance, recent guidance for this.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. Councilmember Jordan, we haven't decided if we're going to do site visits for these appeals. The reason being that the record is basically what was in front of the Single Family Design Board, and so it's not necessary that we have a site visits, but it's something that I intend to talk to the Community Development Director and also the planner who sits with the Planning Commission.
Okay. I'll have some comments on that later. You can stay right engaged there. Remind me or tell me about the ex parte communications differences between appointed people and elected council members, and what's allowed or what has to be disclosed or what is available to either one of those categories.
Councilmember Jordan, it's not necessarily dependent on elected versus appointed. It's the type of action. This is a quasi-judicial action, so ex parte communication is frowned upon.
Okay. Less frowned upon sitting here? I mean, I just remember my time.
Same level of frowned upon.
But I guess I actually can frown more with an appointed person than you can an elected person, right?
We do ask that the planning commissioners, if they had ex parte communications similar to council members, that they disclose those
Okay.
ex parte communications.
And then Ms. Kokinda, so like in the draft showing the changes in that section for procedure for appeals, that's on no page number.
Page 2.
Page 2, in the middle of the page there. So it lists out procedure of appeal to approve, conditionally approve, or deny approval, or then you add in project final approval. Does that language reflect one time, 1 point, or so you would fix that language to 1 point?
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Jordan. So this particular ordinance language is just to route the SFDB appeals to the Planning Commission. And as our current code states, we have, you can appeal project design approval or final approval. And so we're not changing that for this because, as I mentioned, we'd have to do, there's more process stuff that we have to do behind the scenes to kind of figure out how this works and how our land development team looks at things and when. That's really the consideration, because we put a lot of things to say, oh, well, just wait till final approval to where you have to get all of these SWIMP details. So it puts a lot of cost up front. The reason we've done it this way is there are some upfront costs to spending time and all this money to get these details when you don't even know if you have an approvable project yet. So that's kind of the consideration. So we'd need to talk to our land development team partners to kind of work it out. Like, okay, if this was to change, what would you need to see when, so that we're not holding up a project unnecessarily, but they also have enough to feel confident, okay, when this gets to the building permit application stage, we're not going to have major issues and we're not going to have to send them back to planning, which we don't ever want to do that. That's something we try to avoid.
Then tell me how neighborhood noticing works into that timeline. When do we notice, and if that would be different when you got to that point where you just had 1 point of appeal, would you, say, for example, notice later rather than earlier, or would you still notice twice? What would you do?
Great question, thank you. So we did have a process change where we started noticing at project design approval. We used to just notice at concept review for projects that did require mailed notices. Not every single project that goes to a public hearing requires a mailed notice, but some of the ones, like the larger ones, again, that are going to have more of a neighborhood impact or a second story or a brand new home, those all require mailed notices. So what we saw is that we send a mailed notice out at concept review, and then they get project design approval and final approval. And when a neighbor figured out they got final approval, that's when they would appeal. So that was problematic because, again, they've missed the boat on really being able to participate in a meaningful way through that project design approval stage. So we got direction from council to start doing mailed noticing at project design approval. So now we do one at concept review because we really want people to participate as early as possible, and that helps the single-family design board understand what are the issues, what are the impacts, what's going on with this neighborhood. And then we also send a second mailed notice at project design approval because, again, that is the really critical point where people want to really be participating. It's kind of the most meaningful. And If I can just refer back to an earlier question you had about site visits, it's not required that the single-family design board goes on site visits, but in my communications with them, particularly when there's a controversial project, I mean, the majority of them go on their individual site visits. It's not a scheduled one, but they're often identifying that, oh, I went and visited the site, and oftentimes I'll make that recommendation. And the same for staff. I mean, it's always illuminating when you go out on site and you kind of see the context. So people do this on their own time.
So I will have a comment and maybe another question on that. The goal would be to continue that 2-time noticing, even if we got to just the 1-time appeal option.
That is correct. We do not have proposed changes to the 2 times to notice because we think that's really critical, and that, again, opens up the most opportunity for someone to participate.
And you're keeping in this no new evidence thing, which constantly riles me up here because we kind of think there's new evidence, but we don't do anything about it, or we have some weird, oh, let's all vote, but we don't even know what we're voting on is the new evidence versus the old evidence. And I just see that, problematic sitting here. I see that if it's problematic sitting here, I just see that for a case of appeal, particularly, that's when it's problematic to me, is on a case of appeal. Who's determining there's new evidence, who isn't, who's communicating that in advance to a council, in our particular case, not being done well, and then what action are we taking to acknowledge or not acknowledge that we're looking at new evidence because we're seeing emails and applicant, appellants, all these kind of stuff. So I think it's a problem. So tell me how you're going to handle that gift we're giving you on no new evidence for an appeal at Single Family Design Board.
Thank you. So, Councilmember Jordan, I think what you see a little bit of is the challenge of having multiple departments be the communication points. So we work with the applicants. We've been working with them for a year and a half, trying to help out. Sometimes we get appellants contacting us, but they're also, the city clerk's office is the main communication point for an appeal when it comes for a design review for this particular design board. And so they're often kind of the middle person in trying to communicate with you and just having a policy to, get information to you where, we need to vet it. Okay, there's so much material that we have to go through. That's my staff liaison has to go through to kind of verify, did SFDB review this? Was this part of the public record? If so, do we have it? So there's kind of a timeliness of wanting to get information out to you, but then there's also kind of the administrative process, the behind the scenes of, okay, who's communicating what, when, who can answer this question? So it's just a little bit awkward, and so that's where how can we, having it one communication point in the planning division can be really helpful for this planning commission review, because the appellant would, in addition, the applicant would be working with us, the appellant would also be working with us. And our admin staff doesn't communicate only kind of factual information. What time is a hearing? When can I get an agenda? That's what our admin staff can provide, but it's really my design review staff who are the ones who are most up to date on, again, material, content, what needs to be sent, what's identified as new. But also what makes this awkward is that people don't understand the process. So they don't like something, and then they've said it. They've said it multiple times, and they said, I don't care for this. But then they quickly file an appeal within the 10 calendar days, and then they either hire an attorney or try to figure it out themselves to say, okay, how do I, what is the design guideline, and how do I need to craft an argument? So it's really difficult for people who aren't really involved in this process to really understand what are guidelines, how does this work, what are municipal code requirements and standards. So they just start throwing the kitchen sink at things. And so you might, in their appeal letter, they might identify a lot, but what we also see is a lot of new information, new images. The images are probably the most common. And, how bad is that? It is, we have to be honest and say this is new evidence. Technically, the Single Family Design Board didn't look at this, or sometimes it was just never an issue with the Single Family Design Board because it's not an aesthetic issue. And so people might be bringing up complaints about trash location or parking or certain things that are just out that we have to advise. So it's awkward because for a couple of reasons. One, I think the multiple communication points, which we can address a lot of this. I think we can do a better job on helping people kind of being clear about the guidelines, having more materials. We have a lot of paper materials, but I think the web is our most powerful tool, and being able to have one, kind of a point person or a point of contact with city, our planning division liaisons to work on that is extremely helpful. But I don't think we're going to necessarily perfect. We'll probably always be seeing new information, and so there's just going to be a little bit of awkwardness that I think that, we're observing ourselves and trying to figure out how to best deal with this.
Now that I asked this question out loud, I think through it a little better, and I'm listening to you, of course. But I actually think, I would say you're mistaken when you think that everybody goes through the city clerk to get to council on an appeal or process, because everybody has visible access to my direct email, and people know where I live and show up on my front porch. I haven't told them where to find Leslie Wiscombe yet, so she's living the life. But it's true, on Planning Commission, it doesn't run through the individuals like it does for an elected official. It goes through PC Secretary at SantaBarbaraCA.gov. So I think now that I kind of think through kind of what you're saying, that's the nuts and bolts of what you're saying, right? Mm-hmm. It kind of gets controlled a little more, and you can feed what you need to feed out then to the troops.
Absolutely. And I mean, I want to level the playing field too, because it pains me to watch people who don't know anything and are trying to craft an argument, and they might have really valid points, and it's hard. And so, not that I'm, I can be agnostic in terms of how whatever decision is made, but how can I help people articulate, and here's the process, and you're going to get 20 minutes, and this is how this works, and kind of demystifying the issue, like how things work a little bit more, can be super helpful. So when I have had the chance to talk with appellants, it definitely, they're like, oh, now I get it. I wish I would have understood that. So I think, again, even being able to set up a conversation with them about what are the expectations, how does this work, can be very illuminating and helpful. And I think when it's not owned by any one particular group, then that's where you might have some weaknesses in communication. And not by intention, but just, how it's historically worked.
Okay, and then do you want to talk about, after we talk about this, talk about some of your longer-term points you put up there? Should we separate those two?
Thank you. To the chair and Councilmember Jordan, I think that's probably the easiest, the cleanest, if that makes sense.
I'm good for now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Councilmember Sneddon.
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez, and thank you. I see where this is coming from in the description of awkwardness, I guess is a kind way to put it. It's been a little messy. I have some questions about the appeal process as it is now. So recently, since we've had so many, I think we've had more opportunities to be thinking about this process. And before, my understanding, before just recently, was that council's purview was to be able to just approve or uphold or deny an appeal. But really just recently, we're starting to learn about a third option of maybe conditional approval or sending it to Planning Commission or sending it back. And I don't even want to guess at what those are, but I have the sense that we maybe have more options when it does come to council. And this might be a good time to talk about, instead of during an appeal process saying, what are our options, but as it is currently, the current process now, which I don't think has gone consistently on any one of these appeals, how is it supposed to go and what are council's options?
Chair Gutierrez, Councilmember Sneddon. So the council's purview is generally to uphold or deny. However, there are minor tweaks that could be made to a project. For example, we've seen somewhere, you had one, this was a couple of years ago, where there was a privacy issue, and so council just asked that they raise the windowsill height like 4 inches, so something like that. However, these projects have received project design approval, or they have not, and they're appealing that. So it's just those minor things, because the project design approval is like the major decision. It's the massing, the bulk, the scale is all worked out at that point, pretty much. So there are certain things that if you were to change it, it would just destroy the project.
So on appeal, there's sort of a threshold of what would destroy the project or not?
Right. For
And-
example, if you were to move a balcony from one end of the project to another, that could have a significant effect on the architecture of the project. You know, it may be something that single-family design board would never have approved of for other, aesthetic reasons. So it's just those, when we're talking about like a conditional approval, it's a minor thing, like, raise a windowsill up 2 inches to kind of address a.
And what would be different if that process instead went to planning commission?
I imagine it would still be the same. I mean, there could be those little tweaks that the planning commission could do to raise a site, sill height or.
Okay, so the advantage to it going to planning commission is the timing of the calendar. And other than that, I'm not really seeing, it's a decision-making body versus a decision-making body. I don't really understand if the purview stays the same, what the other recommendation is for.
I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm fully, so we've got multiple points. We've got, in terms of the timing to get on, there's 3 points that from an administration and organizational efficiency standpoint, at council, we have to first set a date for an appeal, then we have the appeal hearing, and then we have to write a council agenda report for the resolution. For the planning commission, that's really just a 2-step process instead of a 3-step process. There's a lot timing for the appellant and the applicant. It's all done in-house, so we have 2 right now for any appeal, SFDB appeal to council. We have the city clerk doing 1 mailed notice, but our municipal code requires another mailed notice. So we've got an ad and a notice that are going out, and there's 2 administrative staffs, 1 in the city clerk's office and 1 in the planning division, our admin staff. So I think that it's much more efficient to kind of do it in-house, meaning that the planning commission, we haven't had issues with getting on an agenda. It would be able to go a lot faster. The staff time is very significant for this, and it's more that it's not that from a review standpoint, we also recognize that the Planning Commission is very familiar with looking at plans and understands the design guidelines, and this is part of their process for understanding the findings that are required. And so many of these projects have to go to the Planning Commission anyway, particularly for the ones in the coastal zone. So it just seemed to make sense from our standpoint to be able to make this as a suggestion.
And then for planning commission, issues of neighborhood compatibility, what are other types of things that they hear where they're looking at compatibility in neighborhoods?
So, Councilmember Sneddon, they have to make coastal development finding for any kind of coastal development permit. They have to say that it meets all of the code and the guidelines, and so there are findings that they have to make. I won't say that again, they're not a design review board, but there's one particular finding that this project is consistent with the municipal code and all of the city's guidelines and this and that. And so it's kind of wrapped up in that. And if they felt, they could communicate to the design review body if they felt strongly about something. Again, the aesthetics is not their purview, and that's not the focus. They're a land use approval board, but I just kind of, in terms of thinking about findings and how they're made, and also understanding the process of being very familiar with how a project moves through the process and how applicants move through the process, and also being very familiar with what it's like for neighbors to come out and see kind of these tensions. So they're very familiar with this world. And so that's, again, just another rationale for this particular proposal.
Okay. I have a whole bunch of comments, and I won't try to make them questions to get them in. Just one question, just for an opportunity, and I'm not even sure how to phrase it, but it seems to me that the role of staff, rightly so, is to advocate for applicants, to help them through the process, to get things communicated well to the design review boards, to streamline. We all want that as well, streamlining. And I just have I guess a question about when an appellant comes, and as you say, they're not familiar with the process, they don't know what the guidelines are, have to hire an attorney. If that might be part of the issue, that an applicant has advocacy all the way through, and so that by the time something comes to appeal, I'll speak for myself, I feel like I'm trying to decide between staff's hard work and staff's advocacy and this applicant versus maybe what I genuinely believe is not compatible with a neighborhood, something like that. Is there any comment on sort of the balance between at the point of appeal, when it's supposed to be de novo or independent of each other?
So Councilmember Snedden, so one thing that I would reframe how I think, and this is how I work with all of my staff, but I would reframe it. And my role on staff is I have to serve multiple constituents. It's a really interesting position, and that's why I love city planning more than anything. But I am, clearly we have applicants who are our customers. We think of applicants as customers, but as staff, I'm responsible. I have to make sure our board members are supported, and that is a major role at every single hearing, that we are supporting our board members and helping them to be able to, do they have enough information to be able to even assess a project and determine if a project meets its findings or not. And I also have to serve members of the public. We're not serving one group. We're serving any member of the public, particularly if they've never been part of something. I love working with those people, because those are the ones who really, if they can come out of a meeting and better understand the process or feel a little bit more sophisticated in their participation and feel like they were heard, then we've all done our jobs right. So I'm not just there on behalf of the applicant. And I have to tell this to applicants. I'm like, well, I know, but I'm looking at my board right here, and the SFDB can't make those findings. They're not ready to approve your project because they're also hearing things over here, and you haven't done what you need to do. And if you don't want to set yourself up for appealing a denial, then you need to start making changes. So I have to be real to all groups, and I'm responsible for making sure that all of them have been tended to. So I think that what you've seen for some of these projects, you've seen some really complicated appeals, some that are just down the line, could go either way, I don't know. But what I've seen, and you might think, wow, they might have leaned, the staff might have been more supportive of the applicant. It's just that, again, I think about what it is to be a homeowner and what it is to be a neighbor, and just have these people done enough to get to a point, is this an acceptable project? And it's not going to be perfect, and because you're not going to make everybody happy, but I just want I support the board, and if they've gotten to a point of like, is this acceptable? And so I just want to try to honor that decision and again, try to even the playing field so that people can better participate. And so, yeah, it's that's a huge responsibility to try to take that into account and what I try to do at every hearing.
I'm really glad I asked. That was really gave me a better understanding of your multiple roles also, and that you walk that line really well. And I think if I were to sort of add to that, I see you as sort of a defender of the process, that you
100%.
very much, and I see that in you, in all of these appeals and in the role that you're in. So I didn't mean the question, but that was very, very helpful for me to understand when these tensions come up. Okay, I'll save, I have one. If council had the option, this is a question, to send a project to PC as opposed to going to Planning Commission and that being the final, but if it came to council and council had an option to go to Planning Commission and that be final, what would that do or not do to the process? What I'm trying to get at is I'm not comfortable with council not being in the process at all, and I'm consistent with that. I don't like that when things go to Fire Commission that appeal is final. I don't like things that are final that don't have some opportunity for council, even though it's messy, even though for a variety of reasons, which I'll go into in comments, but what would be maybe a different avenue where it could come to council for comment for what it is that we find disagreeable about something, and then go to Planning Commission and that be final after it passed through?
Thank you, Councilmember Snedden. So I don't recommend that, and the reason is I would just want to keep the process the same as it is today. And the reason being is that's it's multiple hearings instead of one. I'm trying to really reduce the number of public hearings that applicants and appellants have to go through. And again, it adds a lot of administrative work. So, because the question also came up of, well, if it does go to Planning Commission, could you then appeal it to City Council again? And so we know that someone will appeal to the nth degree. And so that's, we didn't necessarily propose that kind of backdoor, even though it's a great idea kind of in spirit and the meaning behind it, and I understand that, that I would just assume keep it as it is today.
Thank you. Those are all my questions for now.
Thank you, Councilmember Snedden. I have a couple questions. Could you just briefly explain why this board was created?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I might have a slide, and you're going to have to forgive me because it's not going to, it might look, well, actually, it might look a little different than the other, actually, I do think I have it in our beautiful design here. Okay, so the single family, so what happened was in 1992, the city adopted the single family design guidelines. It was the first time, it was the creation of the neighborhood preservation ordinance. It was the first time that discretionary review, or public hearings were applied to single family residences. And initially the concern was projects on the hillside because as things get developed, they're the most visible. So there was this movement to be able to create a process because we already had the Architectural Board of Review and the Historic Landmarks Commission, and there was a desire from the community to have more oversight, particularly for hillside projects. What happened was when the Neighborhood Preservation Ordinance was created, the Architectural Board of Review picked up all of these projects, but it got to be so overwhelming, the volume of projects. They had to meet on a weekly basis just to get through all the other development projects that the ABR reviews. So several years later, in 2007, there was a 3-year process to update the neighborhood preservation ordinance. And a lot of that came from the concerns about McMansionizations, the development of the term McMansionization, of building these really huge, massive homes, particularly along Shoreline Drive, that they didn't have to go through any public process. And so creating a discretionary review was the first time we created a public forum for these homes. And as part of what I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation is that one of our larger process improvement goals is that we think that's really important to maintain. We think that there's still a huge spirit of participation, and we want to keep projects that, again, for larger projects that there might be more privacy impacts or neighborhood tension, that there's still public hearing required and a forum for that. So in 2007, the Single Family Design Board was created to alleviate some of the responsibility from the Architectural Board of Review, and now the Single Family Design Board is only responsible for looking at single-family residences or projects in single-family residences that aren't historic. If they're historic, they go to the Historic Landmarks Commission. So that's been the kind of what's been happening since 2007, but I point out here on this slide that since we adopted the new zoning ordinance, or Title 30, and towards the end of 2017, we've been adding more and more responsibility and design review triggers to SFDB, things that they had never necessarily done before. And one example is accessory dwelling units. We created a process that if you check off these boxes, you can just go straight to your building permit and apply for your ADU, but if you don't meet those design criteria, then that switches you to discretionary review and you go to the Single Family Design Board for that. So it's kind of the history. It's important to, I think the spirit of this is just having a little more oversight over Hillside, not making things so large and so massive that you lose a sense of scale and what's the context of a neighborhood, and then creating that forum so people can participate, which is really critical.
Thank you for that. Now, when it comes to the to ex parte communications in the Brown Act, could you please explain what our consequences are for violating that compared to a board or commission member?
Yes, Chair Gutierrez, there's really no difference, and what the ex parte communication does is it leaves a challenge for future legal issue. For example, so a bias, if your decision or planning commission's decision was made, and then the applicant or appellant didn't like the decision, they're able to take what's called a writ to the Superior Court, and then at that point they would probably allege that because of the conversation, ex parte conversation that a council member or a planning commissioner had, that they didn't get a fair shot. Their due process was violated.
Okay, thank you. And just another question would be, what other cities have done this?
Thank you, Chair Gutierrez. I am not 100% sure I just want to say Santa Barbara is really unique, and particularly for design. And there's such a huge emphasis on design review process and making people go through things. So if you go to look at other cities, they don't even have a single family design board. They just use their zoning code, and if you meet those standards, you just go straight to your building permit. And so it's really unique to have this number of design review boards. I was quite shocked when I moved here from the East Coast and kind of understood what Santa Barbara was all about. And so it's a little, even in the Novak report, it calls out kind of a surprise that there are even multiple appeal points. So they were really surprised that you have project design approval and final approval as appealable points for single-family homes, and felt that it was really onerous from a development standpoint, where there could be a lot more emphasis on, rather than putting people kind of having such a onerous process, give a little bit of trust that some people are going to, rather use their money to be able to put improvements into their homes. So there's just what I've seen from other communities is maybe not as intensive level of review, but there are certainly some out there. I mean, there are definitely, sacred, other cities that we could look to. I'm sure Pasadena, other cities that have design review boards, but it might not be to the level of specificity. They might kind of capture a larger group. So I don't know if Ms. Ostringer would say anything else to that, but that's my impression from a planning perspective.
Yes, Chair Gutierrez, I agree. I know there are some cities, particularly coastal cities, that do have design boards, but we are, as Ms. Kokinda said, we are unique in the number of boards that we have.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from my colleagues? Okay. May we have, or Ms. Clerk, do we have any public speakers?
Yes, we do, Chair Gutierrez. Our first public speaker will be Fred Sweeney.
I want to talk about a couple of things. I did appear before the Planning Commission and shared with me 5 or 6 topics that were of concern. One is how minutes are taken at single-family design board, the definition of a size, bulk, and scale, enforcement, definition of neighborhood compatibility, and dispensing of the final appeal final approval is an appeal point. But more importantly, I want to talk about the job here, because part of this is, as Ms. Kokinda said, we're trying to make the field of play a little bit more level, to be fair to everyone, not only to applicants, but to the community. And part of the reason we have these review boards is we love the city the way it looks. It's how it looks. So we have 3 review boards that do that. And at the same time, we have folks that want to build things. And you have review boards saying, well, you can build it, but you need to build it in a certain way. And so that gets down to that discussion. So by going to the Planning Commission, these are folks that theoretically have been appointed there that have expertise in planning, building, and structures, just as the review boards have expertise in aesthetics and style, et cetera. And in theory, both boards should be, in my view, looking at the building, looking at the site, setting aside the personalities involved, setting aside the issues that cause emotions to rise. When you go to council for appeal, the motions and the emotions and the other political viewpoints come to rise because that's what you do as council. Planning commissioners, on the other hand, just need to be looking at the project, not the personalities. So I think that's really a differential by making the appeal go directly to Planning Commission, and that's why it's so important. The enforcement issue is a big deal. There was just a few years ago and just recently, there were projects that came to appeal at City Council that should never have been there. They should have never gotten that far. They could have been circumvented had the process been different before they even got to the City Council. One was a glass retaining wall that was approved by the building permit guy, the on-site inspector, and yet it got appealed. Another one was a location of an ADU that should have just been moved to a different part of the site, and that would have solved all the problems. But yet the community came out in force to be against that. So anyway, I could go on for a long time, but I wanted to hit those high points. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yes, Councilmember Sneddon has a question for you, Mr. Sweeney.
Yes.
Mr. Sweeney, thank you. So in the example of the ADU, that
Yes.
when you say it could have just been moved to a different part of the property, what makes the difference between the purview of Planning Commission being able to say that versus council being able to say that? Like, if, and maybe this is also a question for legal also, so why does the ability to make that kind of recommendation change depending on who's hearing the appeal?
Well, in some view, there are council people that have expertise in a lot of areas, but maybe not land use. And so they may not have, the council may not have recognized, but planning commissions and theoretically are to be looking at that and understand that and could have seen that. So it's a point of view of having that expertise. Yes, council certainly could have said, look, we want to send this back to somebody else and get the building moved, and that would solve the problem. Now, that's a legal issue about whether or not the council could have done that. I'm hoping that the planning commission process that's put in play will allow more of that to occur. In other words, planning commissioners look at it and say, you know what, this needs to go back to the SFDB and get sorted out, or it needs a new staff review because there was something that was missed. And let that happen at that level and not at the council level.
Thank you. And I'm not sure that's what's being proposed. Would Planning Commission actually have that different authority to?
Councilmember Sneddon, no, they wouldn't. What they would do would be similar to what council would do if it was a privacy issue or it was a location of, for the example, an ADU. If council felt that it was a problem, then they would deny the project, basically, and the applicant would go back and try again.
So the difference would be in what Planning Commission could see, but not necessarily a difference in what Planning Commission could do.
Correct. The process would be the same as it is now. It's just the body would be different. It would be Planning Commission as opposed to council.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sneddon. May we have the next speaker, please?
Our next speaker is Leslie Wiscombe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the Ordinance Committee. I'm Leslie Wiscombe, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Planning Commission. We thoroughly reviewed this at our May 11th meeting for over 2 hours, and I just want to say Ms. Kokinda did an excellent job on providing background for the recommended changes and emphasizing the Land Development Team Oversight Subcommittee's efforts to streamline single-family design review project processes, especially in relation to the cumbersome and lengthy appeal process. We've all seen the Novak report. It's been with us for many years. This is a streamlining effort, and I think if you look at an appeal at Planning Commission versus an appeal at City Council, you'll see very big differences in the number of staff that are involved, and very big differences in the number of staff that are involved behind scenes. So I think streamlining is one of the goals of the city and has been for a long time, and I think this helps. The commission spent time discussing the two potential roles in some single-family design projects, and we're used to wearing multiple hats. The first would be if we got a project, as Ms. Kokinda mentioned, that had a coastal development permit. And so we are considering the local coastal plan, the Coastal Commission, the Coastal Act, and we always look at the Single-Family Design Board minutes to see what the comments were from them. So that's one hat that we wear at one type of meeting. If the ordinance changed and we went to being involved in the appeals as the final authority, we would consider not only those other things, but the single-family residence design guidelines, the good neighbor guidelines, the required findings, which we're very used to making in our projects, and the applicant's response to the single-family design board comments and concerns. And so that's multiple hats that we wear. We unanimously supported the ordinance change and felt confident that the commission could handle their responsibilities professionally and thoroughly while achieving a long-term city goal of shortening and clarifying the design process, which I agree with Ms. Kokinda, is very confusing to many people. And we get people before us who come and they're frightened to be in front of us. So I think any way that we can truncate the process and help them and make it clearer really helps the city and helps the city economically with, reductions in staff to do this also. So those are my comments. Thank you. And if anyone has any questions about our meeting, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe.
Chair
Okay,
Gutierrez, I just want
so-
to note that we do not have anybody online who would like to speak.
Thank you.
So
Okay,
no
now,
further comment.
I'd like to open it up to my colleagues for their remarks. Councilmember Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Kokinda, you had a slide with questions. If you could put that back up, so I just make sure I don't wander off too far. An emphatic yes to the changes that you're representing. My caveat would be that you get as soon as possible to the reduction of appeal points. And my caveat to that would be that you remain committed to the 2 existing mailed noticing points. If you wouldn't, then you would be just leading into a pitfall at that last mailing of people who would be just jumping up to do not prior admitted evidence on their appeal. So I think it's important both to notice early, and then as people think what's going through the process, it's kind of on my radar. I appeared a couple times, I sent a letter in, whatever, that they also get that second notice to say, okay, here's also your point in time where you can stand up and appeal if this is approved, kind of thing. And then I get those postcards. There's enough building going on in my neighborhood, but I don't really pay attention to them. So, but I think along with everything else, kitchen sink that's usually on those things, I think we should get used to putting a link to an overview of the process or an explanation of the process. So just a simple link that takes somebody somewhere to say, here's kind of how this whole process works. And a link to some point of the up-to-date status of that particular project. So they can just hit that link and go to whether it's the Single Family Design Board staff report or whatever it is for that particular project. And then a link to what the appeal process would be. And I know somebody may give me stink eye for that, like, it's like waving a red flag in front of the bull, but I think it's important to get that kind of information out there and be transparent about it. If we have a process, we should be telling people about it up front with the rest of the information. And I think I just have one other that refers to that, then I'll save my comments on requests or considerations on the big picture. Site visits bothers me. So it seems to bother a lot of people up on the second floor about doing them or not doing them. So they're equal groups up here. But personally, in my history as a planning commissioner and sitting here too, I have been places where I never would have been ever in this city, but just not on my place of travel. And it shows you. It shows you in your face the challenges on both sides of an appeal. It shows you the challenges of an applicant or a project that's trying to improve something about their life or where they live. And it shows you the flip side of the tension too on the challenges of the neighborhood and what the neighborhood wants to continue with and how they live and their life. And so I sense we're on a get rid of site visits because you can't get people out there. It's staffs out there. It's just this big cumbersome thing. But I guess what I would do is I would make the internal process with Planning Commission gaining this function and And participating in this type of appeal would be to strongly encourage site visits pre-Planning Commission meeting, and then to, just by protocol, to disclose at the appeal hearing. I mean, I think that's important here, and we don't do that here, sitting up here for appeals, but just to simply disclose. To me, if you were even at a single-family design board meeting and people are making a decision there and 4 out of the 5 members would have to disclose they've never been out on the site, I think that's problematic for holding some credibility to that process. And I think it magnifies exponentially at an appeal that if nobody's going out to see the site, and just lends less credibility to the appeal considerations that are taking place. And frankly, I would think further makes credible an appeal to that process by somebody who disagreed with the outcome if people weren't going out to see it. That's a couple of questions. I guess just a quick comment to Mr. Sweeney. I love Mr. Sweeney, but you're looking at somebody with no land use expertise who did 3 terms on the Planning Commission, and I kind of relish that ignorance. I always thought there was more than one place for a kitchen sink, smart enough to be dangerous only type of people. One response I would give you more in line with yours. I felt I know there's an architect on Planning Commission now, but there was a gap since when Bruce Bartlett passed away. And I think and if you look at prior Planning Commissions going back before that, there always seemed to be an architect hanging around Planning Commission too. Bill Mahan comes to mind quickly, but and I think while I don't have anything bad to say about the makeup of a Planning Commission, because I think that's where there's 7 of them, and there's not 7 of Mike Jordans. There's 7 different people, and I think you get a just kind of this potpourri of life that makes it work. And many of the land use or expertise type things can be learned, and just as important though are your place or your presence out in the community and your engagement in the community to kind of just smell or sniff or keep a finger on the pulse. I used to chafe years ago watching Stella Larson when she said, and the Planning Commission would say, well, this doesn't feel right. And I'd throw things at the TV and I'm going, what the heck are you talking about, feel right? Because it's a book of manuals on the wall. And I think it's more than that. I wouldn't get too tied up in trying to worry about sending something like this that's on the ground, community, neighborhood based to a Planning Commission that looks at broader kinds of issues. I think they'll rise to the occasion, and I think they've already unanimously indicated they would like that. So those are my comments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Jordan. Councilmember Sneddon.
Thank you. So first, I'm just thinking about, I've had a lot of frustration lately with the interpretations of size, bulk, and scale, one, and then the other, good neighbor guidelines being the other. And where I really see the sticking points coming to council are when they've already been interpreted one way, and then our purview is to either uphold or deny that interpretation after a project has gone through. I'm often the only person voting no on some things, and usually my finding is that the size, bulk, or scale, or the good neighbor guidelines, to my interpretation of what that would mean in a discretionary finding, is not in the way that I would interpret it. So I have a little bit of a hard time with letting go of that ability to voice that. To me, that's the opportunity to give guidance to SFDB on what it is that I mean by size, bulk, and scale, or good neighbor guidelines, or neighborhood compatibility. And I don't like giving up that opportunity to be able to sort of guide and have oversight into what that interpretation might be. I wonder sometimes if the appeals, the uptick in the appeals are maybe because SFDB is taking a more liberal view of interpretations of good neighborhood guidelines or good neighbor guidelines, or what size, bulk, and scale is appropriate. And if maybe those discretionary findings in their interpretation was scaled a different way, we might not see as many appeals. So I'm not as concerned about the recent uptick in the number of appeals to want to change the whole process. Personally, I would say that council is most definitely in the business of land use decisions. It's one of our biggest areas of influence and decision-making is land use. So I don't see it as out of our purview to want to weigh in on those interpretations. I still think it's appropriate to have appeals come to council, mainly because I'm just generally opposed to anything being final without the option of appeal to council. So maybe there needs to be a different trigger, maybe there needs to be a different consideration of what that would be that is appealable, so maybe a narrowing of that focus. I'm not sure what the fix on that is, but I'm just generally not comfortable with any appointed board having final unappealable decision-making authority. And that's just a process question for me. I think with district elections in particular, council members are most aligned with what neighborhood compatibility means for a neighborhood. We're voted in by neighbors. We walk those neighborhoods. We are familiar with what fits in a neighborhood or not. I wouldn't be, well, I would say it would change the way I appoint planning commissioners if I thought that all of the planning commissioners lived in one area or had one particular perspective one way or another. And I actually really like the way we appoint planning commissioners to be looking broadly at the city and what's best broadly for the city. But when we're looking at neighborhood compatibility, I really feel like because of district elections in particular, I would defer to a council member in their own district saying, this doesn't fit here. And the whole idea of SFDB came about because of the McMansionization, which is the idea that, okay, by the ordinance, you can go lot line to lot line and this big or this tall, but a neighborhood compatibility discretionary finding might allow you to give input that just doesn't fit in that particular neighborhood. And that was a Mesa neighborhood with where that was first coming forward. And I would defer to a council representative who's very familiar in that particular area on what neighborhood compatibility means there. So a little bit rambling, except for that I don't like to give up discretionary input as a council. I can imagine that there might be a number of projects that I would see moving through the process, maybe get appealed, maybe get final approval because it meets all of the required guidelines, but was not what would have been my interpretation of neighborhood compatibility or size, bulk, and scale. And as those are the two main sticking points, I think of planning commission's purview as almost looking at the limits and looking at what can be done and not necessarily being those who's saying that's gone too far in terms of neighborhoods. And along those lines, too, we are, as council members, very accountable to neighborhoods specifically. We can be voted out if we really go outside the lines of what a neighborhood considers, McMansionizing or not, or something like that. Whereas planning commissioners, like I say, it would just give me a really different criteria for planning commissioners. And that's me personally. That would make a big difference for me. Let's see. I think planning commission and land use and getting really granular in terms of applying what's in guidelines. But I personally, on that line too, I don't like the shift recently, it feels like to me recently, in how guidelines are being interpreted as being ignorable, as in they're just guidelines. I've heard that now in a couple different appeals that, well, they're just guidelines, they don't have to follow them. So I am in favor of some of those guidelines becoming ordinance, but I also don't think that would be so necessary if SFDB was given more direction that you really should be having these findings if possible. And after a few of our appeals recently, in talking to the city attorney's office, saying that the findings that I was making, that something was outside size, bulk, and scale and didn't follow the good neighbor guidelines were actually good and suitable findings. But that wasn't the direction we were being given. We were being given that, no, you can't weigh in on size, bulk, and scale or good neighbor because those are just guidelines. So back to wanting to keep the ability to be appealed to is that ability to influence and to give feedback on, no, this is how we're interpreting what good neighbor means, or this is how we're interpreting size, bulk, and scale. And if it doesn't ever come to council or ever pass through for comment or input or guidance, I'm not willing to let go of that ability to weigh in on that. So that's me personally. I think we could streamline in different ways, such as I'm okay with there being one appeal point. I'm definitely okay with some of those design guidelines becoming standards. I think that would streamline as well because it would take it out of the discretionary back and forth. I think I have a feeling I'll be not in the majority on those opinions, but just in inconsistency, I just don't like there to be a final step that's outside of council's purview on that.
Thank you, Councilmember Sneddon. Councilmember Jordan?
Well, I don't know if I can help on the go to council only and not to planning commission, but this is kind of like on my second group of comments on what you really want to see or what to look for in the future. And one of my, I guess, looking at the crystal ball is I just think we're starting to get closer with district elections for council members. I think we're just inevitably sometime moving to district-based PC appointments, and that might help. I know that's probably a charter thing, but I know we're gearing up for charter work for 2024, and so the earlier that discussion point can come up, and that allows us the opportunity to quote unquote control who's serving in whatever role that PC decision is, whether it's something like this or something else, as a representative of a district. I totally agree with the literally, if you tell me something vehemently about San Roque on an appeal, that is like more weight to me than what 5 other people are saying sitting up here, including this guy too, probably. And I would expect the same consideration with the project across the street or around the corner from me too, that I am hearing from the neighbors, that I have a finger on the pulse of that. I just, that's kind of one of those considerations that if we're looking at ways to kind of potentially soften this move or bridge the move, that we also begin to look at PC appointments as being district-based. And then I do also, I know there's an architect on PC now too, but I also just think the position of an architect on Planning Commission, and expressly if they're going to start looking down granularly at residential buildings, is worth considering too, whether we ascribe a preference or even an assigned billet spot for an architect to be on Planning Commission moving forward. How that would work with the goal of district-based PC appointments, I have no clue, but that's why you guys make the big bucks. And then this whole compatibility thing I know is troublesome. So I live in a neighborhood where there is no compatibility, okay? It's very eclectic. Ms. Sneddon lives in a neighborhood where it's much more compatible when you just look at a street. And so how that works is problematic, and this is why they're called guidelines to me, and it's why there's this tension between what's the allowance that you can, I don't know, I'll make up a number, I think it's right, but you can build to 35 feet in my neighborhood, and you might have a street where there's only single-story houses, and does that mean that nobody can ever build 2 stories or to 35 feet because they're still in the 1965 tract homes of flat roof single-story houses there, when the zoning gives you the ability to build more than that? And that's why I think it's important that some things remain guidelines to recognize those situations in the city, and the ability to develop your property and continue to live your life. And if not, then you had a different word for it, but I think you need to start carving some of those out and make them into mandates rather than guidelines. And what are they important, and how do you measure them? If 8 out of 10 houses is only a single story, then you can never build a double story, or whatever that is. And I know that's a rabbit hole of a mess to try and go down. So I think that's why we have this tension, and that's why we have a group put together to work on it. So those are kind of 2 things I was waiting to get past this and kind of talk about, what are the future considerations. And the other one, I'll just say, you had mentioned this too, less trigger points for single-family design board qualification, to have to go through that process based on, which I'm sure you're doing, but based on prior experience of when that has not been able to avoid single-family design board, but has made it through without controversy every time, and whatever that example is. I just think, why are we burdening people with entering into that process if history shows us that every, 99 out of 100 of them have gone through that process successfully and without controversy, and then why are we still making people do it? And let's get those out of the trigger points. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. I, too, am wary about changing this out of respect for how it came to be and what a special place that we live in, that we have the ability to voice our opinions and have our elected representatives represent us. We're voted by the people. The people on these commissions and boards, as qualified as they are, they're not elected by the people, and most people don't even know they exist. So to give them such an important responsibility does worry me a bit, but I do also understand and respect the need to reduce redundancy and bureaucracy. I understand that this was created over 30 years ago now. Obviously, a lot's changed over the last 30 years, and that should be reflected in the way that we govern ourselves. With that being said, I am willing to have this discussion go on further to the full council. If any of my colleagues want to make a motion.
So I'm trying to read the tea leaves, and I'm certainly not going to make a motion that results in another motion that says there's no recommendation of this version to council. So how about a motion just to move it to council for consideration with our comments?
Councilmember Sneddon?
Second, and could I add another comment too? Okay.
Yes.
Just on terms of, I'm not sure how I feel about having district appointments to Planning Commission. I sort of like the balance between Planning Commission looking citywide and district representatives representing districts and citywide, or vice versa. I think if they're both district to district, then we end up with possibly a stalled planning commission, or you lose the ability for planning commissioners to be on for multiple long terms beyond. So I just wanted to add my comment to that too, but I think, yeah, that's all.
Okay. Madam Clerk, did you understand the motion?
I did, thank you. So moved by Councilmember Jordan, second by Councilmember Sneddon, that the Ordinance Committee move the item to City Council for further discussion
With our comments. With our comments.
with the committee comments.
Yep.
Okay, may we have a vote, please?
Yep.
Okay, that passes unanimously. I want to thank everyone for their reports and participation and comments, and I look forward to having this discussion with the rest of the council. I adjourn this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.